The wind whispered through the misty forests of ancient Gaul, carrying with it stories that had been long buried beneath the weight of centuries. Shadows of towering oaks and tangled underbrush seemed to guard secrets older than any living memory, as if the land itself remembered kings whose names were spoken in hushed tones. These were not ordinary rulers, nor were they mere chieftains who rose from the chaos of the post-Roman world. They were the Merovingians, a dynasty whose bloodline was said to flow with a kind of sacred power, a lineage that predated the church-sanctioned kings and whose origins had long been wrapped in myth and mystery. The more one delved into the annals of history, the more the line between legend and truth blurred, and the question persisted: what was it about these kings that made their story so threatening to the powers that would follow? The Merovingians were the heirs of a world in transition, a time when the Roman Empire had crumbled, leaving behind cities half-empty, roads overgrown, and a populace struggling to find order amidst chaos. Into this void, the Frankish tribes rose, formidable and determined, led by warriors who combined cunning strategy with a sense of destiny. Among them, Clovis I would become the most famous, uniting the fractured tribes under a single banner. His conversion to Christianity has been immortalized in countless histories as a moment of divine intervention and the triumph of faith over paganism. Yet beneath this seemingly straightforward narrative, another story lingered, one that hinted at a different kind of power, one that was older, secret, and profoundly unsettling to the emerging church. The Merovingian kings were not merely political leaders. They were considered sacred, their very blood said to hold a divine essence that set them apart from mortal men. Legends spoke of Merovec, the enigmatic founder of the dynasty, whose conception was shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claimed he was the product of a union with a sea creature, a mythical being whose nature was neither fully human nor fully divine. Others suggested the tale was symbolic, encoding an ancient understanding of kingship, power, and the sacred feminine. Whatever the truth, the myth endured, imbuing the Merovingians with an aura of the uncanny, a sense that their authority was not granted by conquest alone, but inherited through a lineage touched by something beyond the ordinary. The Church would later dismiss these stories as heresy or folklore, but for those who sought to understand the depths of European history, the tales were clues to a hidden reality, a secret that powerful institutions had worked tirelessly to suppress. This hidden power was reflected in the unusual practices of the Merovingian kings. Their long hair, untouched and flowing, was said to be a source of their strength and spiritual authority. To cut the hair of a Merovingian was more than a personal violation. It was a symbolic act of stripping away divine legitimacy. Chroniclers of the era, often aligned with the Church, recorded these customs with a mixture of fear, disdain, and awe, describing the kings as strange, almost magical figures whose abilities defied the logic of ordinary men. In their courts, the rituals of kingship combined elements of pagan tradition, Christian symbolism, and arcane knowledge, creating a tapestry of power that few outsiders could fully comprehend. Even the burial practices of these kings were elaborate, designed not merely to honor the dead, but to preserve the sanctity of the bloodline. Some historians have noted the alignment of Merovingian tombs with celestial patterns, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos that had long been lost to later generations. But as the centuries passed, this sacred lineage came under threat. The Church, which had once tolerated the Merovingians as necessary allies in the consolidation of Europe, began to view them as a rival authority. Their independent spiritual practices, their claims of divine right unmediated by Rome, and their mysterious bloodline made them dangerous in the eyes of an institution intent on controlling both faith and power. Propaganda began to frame the later Merovingian kings as do-nothing monarchs, rulers who were incapable of governing and merely occupied the throne. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet resistance persisted, a lineage that endured in secret, preserving knowledge and tradition that would resurface only when the time was right. For those attuned to the subtleties of history, it became clear that the story of the Merovingians was not merely one of kings and conquest. It was a story of suppression, secrecy, and survival against overwhelming odds. The more one listens to the echoes of this lost dynasty, the more it becomes apparent that history has been selective in what it chooses to preserve. Ordinary chronicles cannot capture the full depth of the Merovingian significance, and so their memory survives in fragments. In cryptic symbols carved into stones, in the legends passed down by wandering monks, and in the subtle yet persistent influence they exerted on European culture. There's an almost hypnotic quality to these stories, a pull that draws the curious into a world where myth and history are inseparable, and where the line between truth and legend becomes a place of wonder. As we begin this journey into the hidden history of the Merovingians, it is essential to shed preconceptions, to allow oneself to imagine a world in which kings were not merely political figures, but living conduits of a sacred tradition, whose secrets were carefully guarded, and whose legacy would echo through the centuries, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself once more. In the quiet moments, when the forest fog lingers and the wind hums through ancient stones, one can almost feel the presence of these lost kings. Their story is not merely a chapter of European history. It is a mystery, a riddle woven into the very fabric of civilization. And as we step into the shadows of this hidden world, we are confronted with a profound question. What truths have been hidden from us? And how far would those in power go to ensure that the sacred bloodline of the Merovingians remained a secret, a legend whispered only in the dark corners of time? The land that would become the Frankish kingdom was a patchwork of forests, rivers, and small villages, a place where the ruins of Rome still whispered tales of grandeur and decay. In this world of uncertainty and shifting power, tribes vied for dominance, their lives shaped by the harsh rhythm of war, alliances, and survival. Among them, the Franks emerged as a formidable force, a people whose strength lay not only in their numbers or skill in battle, but in a remarkable ability to unite disparate factions under a single vision. Clovis, the most famous of their kings, became the face of this unification, yet his rise was far from ordinary. It was a story shaped as much by myth as by history, a story in which the ordinary tools of conquest intertwined with a hidden thread of spiritual authority that few outsiders could fully comprehend. The Franks did not simply inherit territory. They claimed legitimacy in a land scarred by the collapse of empire. The vacuum left by Rome had created chaos, but it also provided opportunity. Villages that had once been Roman outposts now became seats of tribal governance. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts, remnants of an older civilization, served as the skeleton upon which the Franks built their emerging society. Their leaders, including Clovis, were adept at navigating the complex landscape of power, using both diplomacy and brute force to consolidate authority. Yet there was more to their success than military skill. The Franks carried with them ancient traditions, beliefs that traced back to the forests and rivers themselves, a deep understanding of symbolism, ritual, and sacred kingship that had survived the fall of Rome. Clovis's conversion to Christianity is often presented in textbooks as a single, decisive moment, a king kneeling in the waters of Reims, accepting baptism as the will of God. But the reality was more intricate, a tapestry of political strategy, personal conviction, and spiritual symbolism. By aligning with the Church, Clovis gained legitimacy in the eyes of the emerging Christian Europe. He could present his rule as divinely sanctioned, a necessary ally in a continent still recovering from the shadow of empire. Yet even this alliance carried tension. The Merovingian kings maintained their distinct sacred identity, a notion of kingship older and far more potent than the Church's structured authority. Their legitimacy was not only political, It was spiritual, encoded into their blood, their rituals, and their very presence. The Church's recognition was a tool, but it could not fully penetrate the mystery that surrounded them. The territories governed by the Franks stretched across a landscape dotted with ancient sacred sites. Hilltops, rivers, and groves served not merely as markers of geography, but as places imbued with memory and power. Many of these sites had been revered long before the Franks arrived, places where the Celts, Romans, and other tribes had left traces of their worship, their rites, and their mythologies. To the Merovingians, these sites were more than historical curiosities. They were touchstones of authority, points of connection to forces that predated both church and empire. By controlling these spaces, the kings could anchor their rule in the continuity of tradition, blending the tangible with the mystical. It was a careful balance of worldly governance and sacred presence, one that required both cunning and an innate understanding of symbols. The notion of divine blood, of a lineage infused with power beyond the mortal realm, set the Merovingians apart from other rulers. It was a subtle yet unmistakable distinction. Ordinary leaders might wield armies, levy taxes, and negotiate treaties, but a king of sacred blood carried an invisible weight, one that shaped how he was perceived and how he acted. Stories circulated of healing, of blessings bestowed upon subjects, of an almost mystical aura that accompanied their presence. These tales, often recorded by church chroniclers with a mix of fear and admiration, positioned the Merovingians as something extraordinary. They were not merely kings. They were conduits of a deeper order, guardians of knowledge and authority that extended far beyond the temporal. Yet this unique power also made them vulnerable. The Church, which could tolerate their influence only so long as it served broader purposes, began to see the Merovingians' autonomy as a threat. Propaganda emerged over time, framing the later kings as weak, incompetent, or irrelevant. The carefully maintained narratives of chroniclers painted a picture of rulers who were shadows of their former glory. Yet in the shadows, the sacred bloodline endured. Secret rituals persisted, knowledge was passed down quietly, and symbols of their authority, long hair, ceremonial garb, sacred regalia, remained potent markers of identity. Even as historians dismissed these practices, the essence of Merovingian power remained, hidden but unbroken, like a river flowing beneath the frozen surface of history. The Franks' society itself reflected this tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. On the surface, it resembled other early medieval kingdoms. Towns, markets, fortifications, and alliances defined daily life. Yet beneath these structures lay an undercurrent of tradition that had survived centuries of upheaval. Rituals, oral histories, and sacred objects carried meaning far beyond their material form. Symbols, gestures, and ceremonies encoded messages of authority, lineage, and divine right that only the initiated could interpret fully. For the Merovingians, these practices were not decorative or ceremonial. They were vital. They maintained the continuity of a sacred order, a lineage that could not be erased by politics alone. As we trace the path of the Franks from scattered tribes to a unified kingdom, the story begins to reveal a deeper truth. History is rarely what it seems. Conquest and politics, while visible and measurable, are often only the surface of a more intricate tapestry. Beneath them lie currents of belief, memory, and secrecy, guiding the choices of men and shaping the destiny of nations. The Merovingians, in their quiet yet potent sovereignty, embodied this hidden dimension of power. Their story challenges us to reconsider the nature of kingship, the meaning of legitimacy, and the forces that have been carefully erased from mainstream accounts. In these early centuries, the stage was set for a dynasty whose influence would ripple through history in ways both seen and unseen. The Franks were more than warriors. They were stewards of a sacred tradition, and the Merovingians were its most visible expression. To understand Europe's hidden history, one must look beyond battles and treaties, beyond the pages of official chronicles, and into the spaces where myth, bloodline, and power intertwine. Only then can the full magnitude of the Merovingian legacy begin to unfold, revealing a world in which kings were more than rulers. They were living symbols of something eternal, something profoundly mysterious, and something that would shape the continent for centuries to come. The story of Merovec, the legendary founder of the Merovingian line, has been told in whispers for over a millennium, a tale that sits delicately between history and myth. It begins not with the clash of armies or the proclamation of kingship, but with a story that is strange, almost otherworldly, a tale of conception unlike any ordinary human birth. According to the earliest chronicles, Merovec's mother, known simply as the Queen of the Salian Franks, became pregnant under circumstances that were as mysterious as they were miraculous. Some accounts suggest that she had encountered a creature from the depths of the sea, a being neither entirely human nor entirely divine. Others interpret the story as allegorical, a symbolic narrative designed to express the extraordinary nature of his bloodline. Regardless of interpretation, the myth endows the Merovingian dynasty with a sense of sacred origin, a lineage that begins not in conquest, but in the mingling of the earthly and the supernatural. The very idea of a semi-divine conception was not unique to the Franks. Across Europe and the Near East, ancient cultures often trace the origins of their rulers to gods, spirits, or celestial phenomena. Pharaohs of Egypt, kings of Mesopotamia, and Celtic chieftains all bore similar narratives of divine ancestry, suggesting a shared cultural understanding of what it meant to rule. Yet in the case of Merovec, this narrative carries an added layer of intrigue. The story implies that his lineage was infused with a power that transcended ordinary human authority, a force that would be inherited by his descendants and preserved through centuries of political turbulence. It was not merely the power to rule. It was a kind of sacred legitimacy, a divine imprimatur embedded in his very blood. The chroniclers of the time, many of whom were aligned with the church, recorded the story with a mixture of fascination and unease. They often framed it as a legend, a curious tale fit for the margins of history rather than its central narrative. Yet even in these accounts, there is a sense of respect, or perhaps fear, for the extraordinary nature of the Merovingian line. They were not kings like any others. They were figures who bridged the human and the divine, whose presence alone could inspire awe or dread. Their authority was not granted by the sword alone, nor by ceremonies sanctioned by Rome, but by something far older, something that seemed to touch the very fabric of creation. The symbolic resonance of Merovec's myth extends beyond the story of his birth. It shapes the identity of the dynasty itself, influencing rituals, artistic depictions, and even the way later kings conducted themselves. The long hair of the Merovingian kings, often described in contemporary accounts, was more than a fashion or a personal preference. It was a sign of their sacred origin, a visible marker of their connection to a lineage that was unlike any other. In many ways, the myth of Merovec becomes a lens through which the entire dynasty can be understood. It is a reminder that their power was as much spiritual as it was political, and that the legends surrounding them were not mere embellishments, but coded memories of an ancient sacred authority. The narrative of Merovec also hints at a profound connection between the Merovingians and the natural world. The sea creature from which he was said to have been conceived can be interpreted in many ways, as a literal being, as a spiritual symbol, or as a metaphor for the hidden currents of power that flow beneath the surface of ordinary life. Water, in particular, has long been associated with fertility, transformation, and the liminal space between worlds. By tracing their origins to such a source, the Merovingians were symbolically linked to forces that were vast, mysterious, and ultimately uncontrollable. A reminder that their authority was not something granted or negotiated, but something inherent, ancient, and enduring. Over time, the story of Merovec became more than myth. It became a template for the way the Merovingian kings were perceived by those around them. They were not simply rulers. They were chosen, set apart, carriers of a bloodline that carried echoes of divine wisdom. Chroniclers and later historians often struggled to reconcile this sacred image with the political realities of the time. Kings could be deposed, armies could be defeated, yet the aura of the Merovingians persisted, intangible yet undeniable. Even as the Carolingians rose to supplant them, the legacy of Merovec remained encoded in stories, rituals, and symbols that refused to vanish entirely. The enigmatic origins of Merovec also invite speculation about the broader currents of European history. Could this story preserve memory of an older religious tradition, one that predated both the Church and Roman authority? Was it a symbolic encoding of knowledge about sacred kingship, secret rituals, or esoteric wisdom meant to be transmitted through bloodlines? Scholars and theorists have long debated these questions, noting the striking similarities between Merovingian myths and the sacred narratives of other ancient civilizations. The very survival of such stories across centuries suggests that they carried significance beyond entertainment or propaganda, hinting at truths that powerful institutions may have sought to suppress. Ultimately, the legend of Merovec serves as both a starting point and a compass for understanding the Merovingians. It introduces the viewer to a world where kingship is not merely political, where bloodline carries meaning far beyond heredity, and where the line between human and divine authority is deliberately blurred. It is a world where myth and history are inseparable, where the extraordinary is hidden just beneath the surface of the ordinary, and where the stories of kings who lived over 1,000 years ago still ripple across the landscape of Europe, waiting for those who are willing to listen, observe, and uncover the secrets carefully preserved in the shadows of history. As we follow the Merovingian line from its mysterious beginnings through the rise and fall of empires, we begin to understand that the past is never fully gone. It lingers in stories, symbols, and whispers carried on the wind through ancient forests and forgotten tombs. And at the heart of this story is Merovec, a figure who embodies the mystery, the sacred authority, and the enduring enigma of a dynasty that would captivate, inspire, and terrify generations to come. The Merovingian kings were unlike any rulers the world had seen, not merely because of the lands they governed or the armies they commanded, but because of the peculiar and unmistakable mark of sacred kingship they carried. Their long hair, flowing freely and uncut from birth, was more than a matter of personal vanity or fashion. It was a living emblem of their divine essence. To lay a hand upon the hair of a Merovingian was to touch the power of the gods themselves, and to cut it was to strip a king of legitimacy, leaving him a hollow figure in the eyes of both people and spirits. Chroniclers of the era wrote of these kings with a mixture of fascination and trepidation, describing them as possessing an almost supernatural presence. Some even claimed that their mere touch could heal the sick or bless the land, an extraordinary ability that further separated them from ordinary mortals and deepened the aura of mystery surrounding their lineage. Their sacred identity extended far beyond hair and ceremony. The Merovingians were steeped in ritual from the moment they were born, their lives framed by practices that were often incomprehensible to outsiders. These rites were not random displays of piety. They were carefully preserved traditions, passed down through generations, meant to ensure that the power encoded in the bloodline remained intact. Many of these rituals had their roots in older pagan customs, fused seamlessly with emerging Christian symbolism. The result was a hybrid form of kingship, one that allowed the Merovingians to operate in the political sphere while simultaneously maintaining a spiritual authority that no ordinary king could challenge. Every crown, every throne, every gesture carried layered meaning, a silent language of power that only the initiated could fully read. Burial practices provide a striking window into this sacred tradition. Merovingian tombs were elaborate, often aligned with celestial patterns, and adorned with objects that conveyed status, power, and esoteric knowledge. Gold, jewels, and symbolic motifs such as serpents, solar discs, and bees appeared frequently, each element carefully chosen to reflect the king's connection to cosmic and divine forces. Archaeologists and historians who have studied these sites note that the care with which these tombs were constructed suggests not mere ostentation, but a deep understanding of ritual, astronomy, and the symbolism of life, death, and renewal. To the people of the time, these were not simply graves. They were sanctified spaces, portals through which the king's power could continue to resonate, even after death. The mystical qualities of the Merovingians were intertwined with the land itself. Sacred groves, rivers, and hilltops were integral to the conception of their authority, serving as physical touchpoints for spiritual power. It was believed that these kings were intimately connected to the natural world, that their strength could ebb or flow, depending on the health of the lands they ruled. This understanding of kingship as inherently linked to the cosmos and the earth was ancient, echoing practices that dated back to the earliest civilizations. Yet by the Merovingian era, such ideas were increasingly at odds with the Church, which sought to centralize spiritual authority under Rome and delegitimize rival claims. This tension between sacred lineage and ecclesiastical oversight created a fraught environment for the Merovingians. While the Church required their cooperation to establish Christian dominance over Gaul, it simultaneously feared their independence. The sacred kingship of the Merovingians represented an alternate path to divine authority, one that existed outside the hierarchy sanctioned by Rome. This was a threat not only to religious control, but to the very narrative of history the Church sought to construct. Over time, chroniclers would depict later Merovingian rulers as weak, incompetent, and irrelevant, a calculated attempt to erase the memory of their spiritual significance. Yet behind these portrayals, the essence of the dynasty remained potent, quietly preserved in ritual, symbolism, and most importantly, in blood. The more one studies these kings, the more one realizes that their sacred power was not performative. It was existential. Every ceremony, every crown, every gesture was a reinforcement of an ancient tradition that linked them to the divine. Healing rituals, blessings over crops, and participation in celestial celebrations were all ways in which the Merovingians asserted their unique status. The people of the time did not merely see these kings as rulers. They saw them as conduits between worlds, intermediaries whose presence ensured the continuity of divine favor upon their lands. It is easy, with centuries of history between us, to dismiss these claims as legend, yet the consistency and detail of the accounts suggest a lived reality, a culture in which sacred authority and political power were inseparable. This sacred kingship also explains, in part, the fear and eventual suppression that would come to define Merovingian history. Kings who carried power in their very blood were inherently difficult to control. The Church's chroniclers sought to diminish them through narrative, painting them as ceremonial figureheads or do-nothing kings, but the symbols, rituals, and sacred practices remained. The people, especially those attuned to the old traditions, continued to recognize the authority of the Merovingian bloodline, even as outward power shifted to new dynasties. In this way, the Merovingians were not truly vanquished. They were obscured, hidden beneath layers of politics, religion, and myth, yet never entirely erased. To encounter the Merovingians, even in historical study, is to glimpse a form of kingship that challenges our modern assumptions. It is a reminder that power is not solely the product of conquest or decree, but can be encoded in blood, in ritual, and in the stories we tell. Their legacy is visible in the ornate burials, the sacred sites, the long hair, and the subtle yet enduring symbols scattered across Europe. These kings, in their quiet but profound authority, remind us that the past is never entirely gone, that the echoes of sacred bloodlines still ripple through time, waiting to be recognized by those willing to see beyond the ordinary. In the forests, tombs, and rivers of Gaul, one can almost feel the presence of these long-haired kings, a living memory of a power that transcended politics, a force that survived because it was sacred, not merely temporal. The Merovingians were more than rulers. They were keepers of a tradition that refused to die, a dynasty whose blood carried secrets, rituals, and knowledge that would challenge the dominion of empires and the authority of the church itself. And as their story unfolds, one truth becomes clear. The sacred kingship of the Merovingians was not merely a relic of the past, but a testament to a deeper, enduring reality, one that connects myth, blood, and the hidden currents of power that continue to shape history. As the Merovingian kings carry their sacred lineage into the centuries, their relationship with the church became increasingly complex, a delicate dance between alliance and unease. On the surface, the two powers seemed aligned. The church needed strong rulers to secure the spread of Christianity across the fragmented lands of Gaul, while the Merovingians benefited from the church's spiritual legitimacy. Yet beneath this facade of cooperation lay tension, suspicion, and an unspoken struggle for authority. The Merovingians embodied a form of kingship that was autonomous, sacred, and deeply rooted in ancient traditions, qualities that the growing influence of the church could neither control nor fully comprehend. This uneasy balance defined much of their reign, a subtle contest of influence that shaped the course of European history in ways both visible and hidden. The alliance was pragmatic. The church required allies to enforce its doctrine, consolidate power, and establish authority in regions still loyal to older traditions. Kings who aligned themselves with Rome could leverage spiritual endorsement to strengthen their rule, uniting tribes under a common faith and securing the loyalty of the people. Clovis's baptism, often depicted as a dramatic conversion of the soul, can also be understood as a strategic affirmation of authority. By accepting the sacrament, he gained the church's imprimatur without surrendering the sacred essence that resided in his bloodline. It was a careful negotiation, a balancing act between public allegiance and private autonomy, between political expediency and spiritual inheritance. Yet the Merovingians' autonomy was a source of tension that the church could never fully resolve. These kings were not merely secular rulers. They were sacred figures whose authority was derived from blood, ritual, and an almost mystical connection to the land. They maintained ceremonies, rites, and symbols that predated Roman Christianity, vestiges of an older, sacred order. Their presence alone was a reminder that legitimate power could exist outside the church's hierarchy, a living testament to the possibility of authority that was independent, unmediated, and potentially threatening. Chroniclers sympathetic to Rome often described these kings in dismissive terms, emphasizing their supposed incompetence or inactivity. In reality, these accounts may have been a subtle form of propaganda, designed to minimize the visibility of a bloodline whose very existence challenged the church's monopoly on spiritual legitimacy. The Merovingians' sacred authority was also expressed in practices that blurred the line between ritual and magic. Healing rituals, blessings of the land, and ceremonial observances were all manifestations of a kingship that was as much spiritual as it was temporal. The long hair of the kings, their intricate burial customs, and their symbolic regalia were more than mere ornaments. They were physical markers of a divine essence. The church, which sought to regulate faith and ritual according to its own dogma, could tolerate these practices only so long as they did not directly challenge ecclesiastical authority. In this way, the Merovingians operated in a delicate space, publicly aligned with Rome, yet privately custodians of sacred knowledge that existed beyond the Church's reach. This tension was particularly pronounced when it came to succession and the management of power within the dynasty itself. The Merovingians viewed kingship as a sacred inheritance, transmitted through blood rather than granted by external authority. This principle conflicted with the Church's efforts to standardize the coronation of kings and consolidate spiritual oversight. Disputes over legitimacy, succession, and divine favor were not merely political struggles. They were battles over the control of sacred knowledge, the authority to interpret divine will, and the ability to shape the narrative of European history. In many ways, the Church's chroniclers and political allies sought to rewrite history itself, casting later Merovingians as ineffective or ceremonial to undermine the enduring influence of a bloodline whose significance extended far beyond secular rule. Despite these pressures, the Merovingians retained their sacred identity, preserving rituals and symbols in ways that were subtle yet enduring. Ancient groves, rivers, and hilltops continued to serve as ceremonial sites, connecting the kings to a spiritual geography that predated both the Church and Roman authority. Objects such as ceremonial swords, sacred relics, and symbolic jewelry carried layered meanings, conveying authority, lineage, and spiritual power. Even as external forces sought to control or diminish them, the Merovingians' presence remained a living embodiment of a sacred tradition that could not be fully erased. The Church's unease with the Merovingians was not merely theoretical. It manifested in historical actions and chronicled suspicions. Advisors and clerics often attempted to curtail the autonomy of the kings, influencing policy, succession, and public image. Some accounts suggest that this led to the rise of so-called do-nothing kings, a narrative designed to delegitimize their sacred authority and recast them as ceremonial figures. Yet these attempts could not completely erase the perception of divinity embedded in the bloodline. Among the people, among the initiated, and in the symbolic landscape of France, the Merovingians remained kings apart, guardians of knowledge and power that even the Church could not entirely suppress. This uneasy alliance shaped the trajectory of European history in profound ways. By negotiating their relationship with Rome, the Merovingians ensured the survival of a sacred bloodline that would influence the continent for centuries, even as new dynasties emerged and older kingdoms fell. Their legacy was not solely in the political realm, but in the enduring symbols, rituals, and sacred spaces that continued to carry echoes of their authority. These elements, often overlooked in conventional histories, are the threads that connect the Merovingians to later esoteric movements, the Templars, and the myths of hidden knowledge that persist to this day. To understand the Merovingians is to recognize the delicate interplay of power, faith, and secrecy. They were rulers, yes, but they were also custodians of a sacred order that survived beneath the surface of politics and chronicled history. Their story is a testament to the complexity of authority, the tension between spiritual and institutional power, and the resilience of a lineage that refused to be fully extinguished. Even centuries later, the whispers of their influence linger in the forests, tombs, and ancient cities of Europe, a quiet reminder that some powers, once sacred, cannot be erased. They can only be hidden, waiting for those who are willing to look closely enough to see the truth beneath the surface. As the centuries progressed, the Merovingian dynasty, once vibrant and commanding, began to wane, not due to a lack of sacred blood or divine favor, but because of the subtle and relentless pressures of politics, intrigue, and the rise of a new power, the Carolingians. The transformation was not abrupt. It unfolded slowly, a shadow creeping across the landscape of Gaul, erasing one dynasty while elevating another. What is often described in traditional history as the decline of the Merovingians was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated shift in power, a coup not waged with swords alone, but with strategy, persuasion, and the subtle manipulation of perception. Over time, the Merovingian kings became the do-nothings, the ceremonial figures whose sacred authority was dismissed, their divine blood hidden beneath a cloak of apparent incompetence. Yet beneath this crafted narrative, the sacred lineage persisted, quietly enduring, its legacy woven into the very foundations of European power. The seeds of this change were sown in the alliance between the Church and the emerging Carolingian line. While the Merovingians had long served as both political and spiritual leaders, their independence increasingly troubled ecclesiastical authorities. Kings who derived authority from sacred blood, whose legitimacy existed outside Rome's hierarchical structures, were difficult to control. The Church sought to centralize spiritual and temporal power, and the Merovingians, with their long hair, rituals, and subtle connection to ancient traditions, represented challenge. By fostering and supporting the rise of the Carolingians, the Church could gradually redirect the flow of legitimacy, ensuring that kingship was no longer something inherited through sacred blood alone, but something sanctioned and validated by Rome. The transition was gradual and nuanced. Pepin the Short, a shrewd and ambitious noble, recognized the opportunity to solidify his claim to power. By aligning closely with the papacy, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a divinely sanctioned ruler, a king whose legitimacy was guaranteed by the authority of the Church itself. This alliance was crucial. It lent Pepin the aura of divine approval, masking the political maneuvering and the displacement of a sacred bloodline behind the veneer of spiritual righteousness. The Merovingians, meanwhile, were subtly marginalized. Kings who had once wielded unquestioned spiritual influence were recast in the historical narrative as weak or ineffectual, their sacred rituals minimized, their powers questioned. History itself became a tool of suppression, shaping perception even as the bloodline endured quietly in the shadows. The so-called do-nothing kings were not truly inert. They had simply been constrained by forces that neither chroniclers nor historians always fully acknowledge. The sacred authority embedded in their blood could not be extinguished entirely, but it could be contained, redirected, or obscured. Ceremonial roles replaced active governance. Symbolic gestures replaced practical decisions, and rituals once central to kingship became private and secretive. The very essence of their power, encoded in blood, tradition, and ritual, remained intact, but its public expression was muted. This strategy of subtle suppression ensured that the Merovingians would fade from the political stage without provoking overt rebellion, preserving their legacy in secret while the Carolingians assumed prominence in the public eye. Yet even as their political influence waned, the Merovingians' sacred significance persisted in ways that ordinary history could not erase. Symbols, ceremonial objects, and sacred spaces continued to carry the imprint of their lineage. Royal tombs, mysterious relics, and alignment with celestial patterns testified to a tradition that extended far beyond politics. The Church may have reshaped the narrative, but the sacred currents remained beneath the surface, waiting for those capable of perceiving the deeper truth. In some ways, the Merovingians had become a dynasty of shadows, hidden from the chronicles of power, yet silently guiding the course of European esotericism, legend, and symbolic authority. This transition also illustrates a broader truth about history. The narratives we inherit are often as much about suppression as they are about recording events. The rise of the Carolingians, framed as the natural continuation of kingship, obscured the sacred origins of the Merovingians. Propaganda, selective chronicling, and historical rewriting recast sacred kings as ceremonial figureheads. Yet those attuned to esoteric knowledge could still perceive the continuity of authority, the echoes of divine blood, and the lingering rituals that connected generations. What appeared as a disappearance was, in truth, a survival in hidden form. The marginalization of the Merovingians did not happen overnight, nor was it without resistance. Courtiers, loyal factions, and initiates of sacred knowledge worked quietly to preserve the rites, symbols, and ancestral memory of the kings. Some of these traditions survived in secret societies, whispered legends, and coded symbols passed down through generations. Even as new dynasties consolidated power and the church rewrote the story of kingship, the Merovingian influence persisted, encoded in objects, architecture, and obscure rituals that continued to inspire awe and curiosity. In this way, the fall of the dynasty was less a defeat and more a transformation, a shift from overt sovereignty to hidden guardianship of a sacred tradition that the world was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. The story of the Merovingians' displacement serves as a reminder of the subtle ways in which power operates. Armies and treaties may be visible to the eye, but influence, legitimacy, and sacred authority often move in unseen currents, shaping the trajectory of history beneath the surface. The Church's alliance with the Carolingians, the portrayal of Merovingian kings as ceremonial, and the strategic manipulation of narrative all point to a larger game of power, one in which sacred bloodlines could be controlled, marginalized, or hidden without the need for direct confrontation. This is the hidden layer of European history, a world in which perception is crafted as carefully as action, and in which myth, ritual, and bloodline intersect with politics in ways that continue to fascinate and perplex historians and mystics alike. Even as the Merovingians receded from the visible stage of European politics, their sacred essence persisted, quietly influencing the esoteric traditions that would follow. The rituals, symbols, and myths that once defined their kingship were absorbed into new contexts, from the architecture of cathedrals to the secretive practices of later orders and societies. Their disappearance from chronicles did not signify the end of their power. Rather, it marked the beginning of a hidden legacy, a lineage whose influence would ripple silently through the centuries, touching those who sought to preserve or rediscover the secrets of sacred blood and ancient kingship. The story of the Merovingians' fall is therefore not merely a political narrative, but a meditation on survival, secrecy, and the enduring potency of sacred lineage. Even in obscurity, even when history seemed to turn its back on them, their blood, their rituals, and their esoteric traditions endured. And in the hidden spaces of Europe, ancient forests, forgotten tombs, and sacred sites, they left whispers of a dynasty that refused to be forgotten, a bloodline whose power, though constrained, remained intact, waiting for the moment when it could be recognized and understood once more. The legacy of the Merovingians is perhaps most vividly preserved in the silent testimony of their tombs, relics, and sacred artifacts, remnants of a dynasty whose influence extended far beyond the political arena and into the very heart of esoteric tradition. These relics are more than mere objects. They are vessels of power, memory, and symbolism, carefully crafted and safeguarded to reflect the sacred authority embedded in the bloodline. From intricately decorated ceremonial swords to jeweled ornaments and cryptic inscriptions, each artifact carries layers of meaning, a silent language that spoke of divine right, cosmic alignment, and the hidden currents of power that coursed through the Merovingian dynasty. To encounter them is to glimpse a world where kingship was inseparable from ritual, and where material objects were charged with spiritual significance beyond the comprehension of outsiders. Merovingian tombs, in particular, offer a haunting glimpse into the worldview of this enigmatic dynasty. Unlike ordinary graves, these resting places were meticulously designed, aligned with celestial patterns, and often accompanied by symbols that resonated with both pagan and Christian traditions. Gold, gemstones, and intricate carvings adorned these spaces, reflecting the dual purpose of honoring the dead and preserving the sacred essence of the bloodline. Archaeologists have noted that the positioning of certain tombs corresponds to solar and lunar cycles, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and a desire to integrate kingship with the rhythms of the cosmos. Such practices hint at a belief that the king's influence did not end with death, but continued to resonate through the physical and spiritual worlds, ensuring that the sacred lineage remained potent and unbroken. Among the most intriguing artifacts are the ceremonial swords and regalia, which were not mere instruments of power, but symbols of divine authority. These objects were often inscribed with cryptic symbols, mystical designs, and motifs that spoke to the king's sacred role. The sword, for instance, was more than a weapon. It was a conduit of energy, a tangible representation of the ruler's connection to both the earthly and celestial realms. To wield such an object was to participate in a lineage that transcended ordinary kingship, to carry forward a tradition that merged the practical demands of rule with a spiritual mandate that had existed for centuries. Each object, from scepters to crowns, was meticulously maintained, charged with ritual significance, and passed down through generations, ensuring continuity of authority even as political circumstances changed. Relics associated with the Merovingians also suggest connections to broader esoteric traditions that extended beyond the borders of Gaul. Some artifacts bear striking resemblance to symbols found in Celtic, Gallo-Roman, and even Near Eastern mystical practices, hinting at a network of knowledge that transcended time and geography. Scholars and theorists have speculated that these objects were part of a system of sacred knowledge, encoded in art, design, and ritual, meant to preserve secrets that could not be transmitted through ordinary means. Such relics acted as repositories of hidden wisdom, tangible evidence of a sacred order that persisted quietly even as the dynasty's public authority waned. The burial practices of the Merovingians also reveal a careful blending of belief systems. Tombs often contained Christian symbols alongside older pagan motifs, suggesting that the kings navigated multiple spiritual frameworks to maintain both legitimacy and continuity. This synthesis allowed the Merovingians to operate in a politically Christianized landscape while preserving the deeper, more ancient traditions that defined their lineage. Even in death, the kings embodied a balance between the temporal and the sacred, a reminder that the true power of their bloodline extended beyond life, ceremony, or public perception. The arrangement of grave goods, the selection of burial sites, and the integration of cosmic alignments all point to a sophisticated understanding of sacred authority and a deliberate effort to preserve it for posterity. The existence of these artifacts also raises questions about what knowledge may have been hidden from the public eye. If the Merovingians' sacred authority was encoded in their blood, their rituals, and their relics, then it follows that those who inherited these objects also inherited a measure of power. What secrets did these ceremonial items hold? How did they function in maintaining the influence of a bloodline that was increasingly obscured by politics and the church's narrative? While many answers remain shrouded in mystery, the artifacts themselves serve as enduring evidence that the Merovingians' legacy was not confined to written chronicles or oral legend. It was material, tangible, and intricately connected to the spiritual and mystical currents of their time. In some cases, these relics may have influenced later European traditions, from sacred regalia of medieval monarchies to the symbols and rituals adopted by secretive orders. The Templars, Freemasons, and other esoteric societies that emerged in subsequent centuries were steeped in symbolic practices and myths that bear striking parallels to Merovingian motifs. While direct connections remain speculative, the continuity of symbolic language, ritual structure, and sacred artifacts suggests a hidden lineage of knowledge, one that survived the public fall of the dynasty and continued to shape the spiritual and mystical imagination of Europe. Even today, the locations of certain Merovingian relics remain cloaked in secrecy, protected by cryptic markers, private collections, or the passage of time itself. This deliberate obscurity may have been a continuation of a long-standing tradition, a recognition that sacred power must be safeguarded, hidden from those who might exploit it, while remaining accessible to those who understand its meaning. The relics serve as silent witnesses to a dynasty whose authority transcended politics, a tangible reminder that the Merovingians were not merely rulers, but custodians of knowledge, blood, and ritual that extended far beyond the ordinary bounds of kingship. Encountering these tombs, relics, and artifacts is to step into a world where time, power, and the sacred intertwine. It is a world in which kings are not defined solely by conquest or law, but by the careful preservation of traditions, rituals, and symbols that encode authority beyond human comprehension. Each artifact, each tomb, and each carefully placed object carries whispers of a lineage that refused to vanish, a bloodline whose sacred essence endured even when public power shifted, and a legacy that continues to inspire mystery, speculation, and fascination to this day. The story of the Merovingians does not end with their political marginalization or the concealment of their sacred authority. It extends far beyond the public eye into the hidden corridors of European history, linking in subtle yet profound ways to the emergence of the Templars and the esoteric knowledge they are said to have guarded. The Knights Templar, often portrayed as a monolithic military order dedicated solely to the Crusades, may have been more than just warriors. They were custodians of secrets, symbols, and relics whose origins trace back centuries before their foundation. Many scholars and theorists suggest that the Templars' fascination with sacred geometry, relics, and coded symbolism echoes the ancient practices of the Merovingians, whose sacred bloodline, rituals, and ceremonial artifacts were carefully preserved, even as political forces sought to suppress them. In this sense, the Templars were not only knights, but inheritors of a hidden legacy, guardians of a knowledge that had survived the collapse of one dynasty and the rise of another. The connection between the Merovingians and the Templars begins with the notion of sacred blood. The Merovingians were believed to possess a lineage imbued with spiritual potency, a bloodline that linked them to ancient powers, mystical rites, and a divine mandate. The Church and the emerging Carolingians may have sought to obscure or delegitimize this power, but the knowledge of its significance endured. When the Templars rose to prominence during the Crusades, their mission extended beyond military conquest. They became protectors of sacred relics, keepers of secret wisdom, and interpreters of symbols whose meanings often eluded ordinary understanding. It is within this context that the Merovingian bloodline may have intersected with the Templar legacy, its potency preserved through coded symbols, ceremonial practices, and guarded knowledge. Templar castles, strongholds, and vaults often incorporated architecture and design elements that suggest an understanding of sacred geometry, cosmic alignment, and esoteric symbolism, themes that were central to Merovingian ritual and burial practices. The parallels are striking. From the positioning of tombs and relics to the careful preservation of objects charged with ritual significance, the Templars' methods of safeguarding knowledge mirror those of the ancient kings. Some theorists even propose that certain Templar treasures, relics, manuscripts, or sacred vessels, may have been inherited from or inspired by Merovingian sources, encoded with the same secrets that had guided kings for centuries. These were not ordinary objects. They were instruments of power, memory, and continuity, ensuring that the sacred essence of the bloodline survived through generations, hidden beneath layers of politics, myth, and secrecy. The notion of the Holy Grail is particularly relevant in this context. While the Grail has been depicted in countless myths, legends, and literary works, Many interpretations link it not merely to a physical cup, but to the concept of sacred bloodline and divine inheritance. The Merovingians, whose lineage was considered sacred, may have been the living embodiment of what the Grail represented, a continuity of divine essence, encoded in blood, ritual, and tradition. Templar involvement in Grail lore, whether through direct guardianship or symbolic preservation, could represent an intentional effort to protect and transmit the essence of this sacred lineage. The Grail, then, is less a static object and more a representation of continuity, secrecy, and spiritual potency, qualities central to both the Merovingians and the Templars who followed centuries later. The rituals, ceremonies, and symbols associated with the Templars often mirror Merovingian practices, suggesting a deliberate continuity of knowledge. Long hair, sacred regalia, cryptic inscriptions, and celestial alignments, all of which defined Merovingian kingship, find echoes in Templar tradition, architecture, and ceremonial practices. Even the secrecy surrounding the Templars, vaults hidden beneath fortified castles, manuscripts concealed from public view, and codes embedded in art and architecture, reflects the preservationist instinct that guided the Merovingians. Knowledge was power, and sacred knowledge was both dangerous and invaluable. By safeguarding it, the Templars became the invisible custodians of a legacy that the church and secular powers could neither control nor fully understand. The preservation of this knowledge was not purely symbolic. It had practical and spiritual implications. The Templars, like the Merovingians before them, operated within a framework that combined temporal authority with sacred responsibility. Whether through the management of relics, the guardianship of sacred sites, or the interpretation of mystical symbols, they maintained a continuity of spiritual influence that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Templar secrecy was therefore not mere paranoia or desire for power. It was a deliberate measure to protect the integrity of a sacred legacy, one that might otherwise be corrupted or lost to history. Even after the suppression of the Templars in the early 14th century, the influence of their practices and the legacy of the Merovingians endured in subtler forms. Secret societies, esoteric orders, and mystics across Europe claimed to trace their knowledge and symbols back to these ancient traditions. Whether through manuscripts, ritual, or symbolic art, the essence of Merovingian authority and Templar guardianship persisted, a hidden thread woven through centuries of European history. The sacred bloodline, the careful preservation of artifacts, and the coded wisdom embedded in ritual all survive beyond the fall of dynasties, surviving the overt politics of kings, popes, and empires. In this way, the Merovingians and the Templars are bound together in a narrative that transcends politics, war, and religion. Their connection lies not in simple lineage or direct succession, but in the continuity of sacred knowledge, the guardianship of hidden power, and the careful preservation of tradition against forces that sought to suppress it. By tracing these threads, one begins to understand that history is not merely a record of events, but a map of hidden currents, secret alliances, and enduring mysteries that survive beyond the reach of conventional chronicles. The sacred bloodline, encoded in ritual, relics, and the Templar legacy, becomes a lens through which the hidden structure of European history can be glimpsed, revealing a world where kings, knights, and mystics all participated in the quiet preservation of extraordinary power. The story of the Merovingians' connection to the Templars reminds us that history is never simple, that power is rarely only what is visible, and that sacred knowledge, once established, cannot easily be extinguished. Even in obscurity, even when public narratives cast dynasties as fallen or orders as suppressed, the hidden currents endure, guiding the flow of influence, shaping esoteric traditions, and preserving the secrets of bloodlines whose significance transcends time. In these shadows, one can begin to sense the true scale of the Merovingian legacy, a dynasty whose influence survived through secrecy, whose bloodline carried sacred authority, and whose connection to the Templars ensured that its mysteries would remain alive, concealed, and profoundly compelling across the centuries. The Merovingian dynasty, with its sacred bloodline and secret rituals, was not merely a political force. It was also a repository of prophecy, mysticism, and esoteric knowledge, a conduit through which ancient wisdom flowed into the unfolding story of Europe. Long before chronicles of kings and battles recorded the mundane events of history, the Merovingians were entwined with visions, omens, and mystical signs that shaped the perception of their reign. Prophecies, often attributed to seers, druids, or early Christian mystics, spoke of kings whose blood carried extraordinary power, kings whose presence could tip the balance of nations or awaken forces beyond ordinary comprehension. To the people of the time, these were not fanciful tales. They were warnings, assurances, and glimpses into a world where the sacred and temporal were inseparable. Some accounts suggest that the Merovingians were seen as living symbols of divine favor, their births and actions interpreted as omens of future events. The timing of a king's birth, the alignment of stars, or the circumstances of a coronation were imbued with meaning, seen as indicators of destiny and spiritual authority. Chronicles often noted unusual phenomena surrounding the kings, strange lights in the sky, unusual weather patterns, or prophetic dreams experienced by those close to the throne. These events were more than curiosities. They were perceived as evidence of the extraordinary power inherent in the Merovingian bloodline, a validation of their sacred role in a world that teetered between the known and the mysterious. Mysticism played a central role in reinforcing the authority of the Merovingians. Their connection to sacred sites, relics, and rituals created a network of spiritual power that extended across both visible and invisible realms. Sacred groves, rivers, and hilltops served not only as ceremonial spaces, but as points of mystical resonance, channels through which divine influence could flow. Objects of power, carefully preserved artifacts, and ceremonial regalia acted as conduits of energy, amplifying the king's sacred authority and ensuring continuity of the bloodline's potency. In this sense, the Merovingians were not just rulers. They were living focal points of a mystical system, custodians of knowledge that had existed for centuries before their rise. Prophetic texts associated with the Merovingians often hint at their central role in a larger spiritual narrative, one that stretches beyond the boundaries of time and politics. Some prophecies describe a king who would unite or divide nations, a ruler whose bloodline would hold secrets essential to the survival of sacred knowledge. Others suggest that the dynasty was linked to a hidden understanding of the cosmos, celestial cycles, and the interaction between human and divine forces. These prophecies, preserved in manuscripts, oral traditions, and even encoded in symbolic art, indicate a worldview in which kingship was both spiritual and temporal, and in which destiny was intertwined with lineage. The mystical significance of the Merovingians also finds resonance in the symbolism that permeated their reign. Animals, celestial motifs, and geometric designs appeared in regalia, architecture, and ceremonial objects, each carrying layered meaning. Serpents, for example, often represented hidden knowledge or transformative power. Solar discs signified divine favor and cosmic order. Bees symbolized industry, continuity, and sacred hierarchy. These symbols were not decorative. They were a visual language, a means of communicating the sacred authority of the bloodline to those trained to understand it. Even today, echoes of this symbolic language can be found in medieval art, architecture, and esoteric traditions, suggesting that the influence of the Merovingians extended far beyond their immediate political sphere. The prophetic and mystical aspects of the Merovingians also intersect with the idea of hidden knowledge and secrecy. Their sacred bloodline, while public in some respects, was also the focus of esoteric teachings meant to be guarded from ordinary understanding. Rituals were conducted behind closed doors, symbols encoded in architecture and artifacts, and knowledge passed only to those initiated into the mysteries of the lineage. This secrecy allowed the Merovingians to maintain spiritual authority even when political power waned, ensuring that their influence persisted quietly beneath the surface of conventional history. Furthermore, the mystical traditions of the Merovingians suggest a profound connection to the cycles of nature, the cosmos, and the unseen forces that govern existence. Kings were not merely participants in ritual. They were embodiments of a system that linked human society to cosmic patterns. Their actions, words, and even their presence were believed to influence not just the fate of kingdoms, but the very flow of spiritual energy across the land. This understanding of sacred kingship, in which prophecy, ritual, and bloodline converged, created a framework of authority that was remarkably resilient, capable of surviving political upheaval, suppression, and the deliberate rewriting of history. The enduring fascination with the prophetic and mystical Merovingians reflects humanity's desire to glimpse the hidden layers of reality, to understand how power, destiny, and the sacred interact. Even centuries after the last true Merovingian kings ruled, their legacy persists in legends of secret bloodlines, hidden knowledge, and esoteric wisdom that may still influence events in subtle ways. The combination of prophecy, mysticism, and sacred authority makes the Merovingians unique among European dynasties. They were rulers whose influence was not only historical, but spiritual, not merely temporal, but eternal, existing simultaneously in the realm of the seen and the unseen. Ultimately, the prophetic and mystical heritage of the Merovingians invites reflection on the nature of power and history itself. Their story reminds us that authority is not solely a matter of conquest or law. It can be encoded in blood, preserved through ritual, and safeguarded through secrecy. Prophecy and mysticism provided a framework through which the dynasty's sacred power was understood and legitimized, allowing the Merovingians to endure in the collective imagination long after their political dominance had faded. In the tombs, relics, and whispered legends that survive, the echoes of this sacred authority remain, an enduring testament to a bloodline whose significance continues to captivate, mystify, and inspire those willing to seek the deeper truths hidden within history's shadows. The legends of the Holy Grail have echoed through time like whispers of a secret too sacred to speak aloud. For centuries, poets, monks, and mystics have sought to describe it. A chalice, a stone, a vessel, a symbol of divine grace. Yet behind the poetic veil lies something older, deeper, and infinitely more human. To understand the Merovingians, one must confront this paradox. Was the Grail ever a cup at all? Or was it the blood that flows through veins, the lineage of divine ancestry concealed beneath centuries of coded allegory? The tale of the Grail, as we know it today, took shape in the late 12th century, emerging mysteriously from the courts of Europe just as the Knights Templar reached the height of their power. In the writings of Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, we find a curious transformation. The Grail is not always described as a cup, but as a radiant stone, a vessel of light, or an object that sustains the worthy. This was no coincidence. These poets were not inventing. They were transmitting something hidden beneath the skin of medieval faith, knowledge passed through secret channels, cloaked in metaphor to survive the fires of the Inquisition. To the Church, the Grail was a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, the cup that caught his blood upon the cross. But in the language of mystery traditions, blood meant something far more powerful: continuity, lineage, divine inheritance. The French phrase sang real, royal blood, over time was compressed and misread as sangreal, holy grail. But to the initiates of the hidden orders, the two were one and the same. The vessel was the womb, the bloodline, the sacred current flowing from Christ and Mary Magdalene, their union forming the seed of a royal family whose descendants walked hidden among men. It is here that the Merovingians step back into the light. The idea that their blood carried divine power was not born in the Middle Ages. It was remembered. Their kings were said to heal by touch, to receive visions, and to rule not merely by right of conquest, but by the sanction of heaven. The Grail romances may have been coded genealogies, recording the secret of a bloodline that traced back not just to Merovingian, but to something much older, perhaps even to the very heart of early Christianity, before the Church reshaped its narratives. When Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote of the Graal as a stone that fell from heaven, guarded by Templar-like knights, he hinted at something both material and metaphysical. The Grail was described as a source of endless nourishment. It sustained life, renewed the spirit, and granted wisdom to those who approached it in purity. Could this have been an allegory for the sacred bloodline itself? An unbroken spiritual current sustained through generations, guarded by secret brotherhoods like the Priory of Chaon and the Templars? The Templars themselves, often portrayed as mere warriors, were initiates of something deeper. Their emblem, two riders on one horse, suggested duality, perhaps the twin currents of masculine and feminine, body and soul. Their presence in Jerusalem placed them at the heart of ancient mysteries, where Jewish, Christian, and pre-Abrahamic traditions intertwined. Some accounts claim they uncovered hidden relics beneath the Temple Mount. Not mere gold, but records, genealogies, or artifacts proving a direct link between early Christian families and European royalty. If true, these discoveries would explain both their immense influence and their sudden, violent downfall. The Church could not allow such ideas to survive. If Christ's legacy was not a singular divine miracle, but a living bloodline, if the sacred was inherited rather than bestowed, then the entire structure of spiritual authority would crumble. The Grail myth became both a revelation and a shield, a story that spoke truth to the wise while hiding it from the uninitiated. Through poetry, song, and symbol, the secret was preserved, the divine made flesh, the holy made hereditary. Across the centuries, the Grail evolved. It became the object of endless quests, the unreachable perfection knights sought, yet could never find. But perhaps the riddle was never about finding an object. It was about remembering a truth. The Grail was not something to be discovered in a temple or guarded in a chalice of gold. It was something carried within, in blood, in spirit, in the quiet continuity of a chosen line. The quest was an allegory for awakening, a journey to recall the buried divinity within humanity itself. The Merovingian kings, if this interpretation holds, were not simply monarchs. They were stewards of an idea, that the spark of divinity could flow through human blood, pass from generation to generation, a reminder that heaven and earth were never meant to be separate. In their fall, that idea was buried beneath centuries of orthodoxy and fear. Yet through the Grail romances, the sacred language of symbol kept the secret alive. From this perspective, every knight who rode in search of the Grail was retracing the path of memory, not toward a relic, but toward the truth of origin. The vessel and the blood were one. The cup symbolized the feminine principle, the womb of creation. The blood within symbolized life, continuity, and the divine spark. Together they formed the sacred union, Christ and Magdalene, spirit and matter, king and queen, a balance lost in the march of dogma. In the quiet candlelight of monasteries, scribes illuminated these truths in coded forms. The Grail's glow in their manuscripts was not the shimmer of gold leaf, but the reflection of an idea too dangerous to name. They knew that kingdoms rise and fall, but symbols endure. And so, in the shadows of medieval Europe, a secret history persisted, whispered through stories of knights and holy relics, sustained by those who believe that the blood of the divine still moved unseen through the veins of humankind. To speak of the Holy Grail, then, is not to speak of a cup, but of a covenant, an unbroken thread stretching from the mystery schools of antiquity through the Merovingians, the Templars, and into the hidden orders that followed. Whether the bloodline is literal or metaphorical, its purpose remains the same: to remind us that the sacred is not distant, not confined to altars or chalices, but living and pulsing within us all. The Grail is not lost. It is forgotten, waiting to be remembered by those who dare to see the divine reflected in their own blood. Tucked away in the sun-baked hills of southern France lies a small, unassuming village that has become the stage for one of history's most enduring mysteries. Rennes-le-Château is quiet today, its streets lined with modest homes and a centuries-old church. Yet beneath its serene exterior lies a story of hidden wealth, secret knowledge, and a bloodline whispered about in hushed tones for centuries. For those who trace the echoes of the Merovingians, Rennes-le-Château represents more than a forgotten village. It is a nexus where legend, history, and secrecy converge, a place where the past refuses to die quietly. The story of Rennes-le-Château begins in the late 19th century with a parish priest named Berenger Saunière. Assigned to the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, he appeared to stumble upon treasures that were never fully explained. He undertook lavish renovations, constructed enigmatic towers, and filled his home with mysterious symbols and artworks, prompting questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Where did the money come from? What secrets were hidden in the parchments and coded manuscripts he allegedly discovered? For decades, researchers and treasure hunters have speculated that Saunière had unearthed knowledge connected to the Merovingian bloodline, perhaps even a map to a lineage considered sacred and dangerous. What makes Rennes-le-Château so compelling is not merely the sudden wealth of a humble priest, but the symbols scattered throughout the village, whispering of hidden truths. The church itself is adorned with enigmatic paintings, each brimming with symbolism. Magdalene is central, not as a peripheral saint, but as a figure of prominence, echoing the idea of the sacred feminine intertwined with the Merovingian legacy. Saints, angels, and biblical scenes are rendered in unusual ways, suggesting a hidden code that the untrained eye cannot read. It is as if the very walls of the village were designed to guard secrets, to speak only to those attuned to the old knowledge. Some researchers suggest that the parchments Saunière discovered were genealogical records, chronicling a sacred bloodline stretching back to the Merovingians and possibly even connecting to early Christian figures. If true, these documents would represent a bridge between myth and history, a confirmation that the Merovingians did not vanish as conventional accounts claim, but survived in obscurity, their legacy protected by layers of secrecy. Rennes-le-Château becomes a place where the whispers of centuries converge, a touchstone for those seeking to uncover the hidden continuity of European royalty and its sacred currents. The geography of the region itself seems conspiratorial, as if the land conspires to conceal the truths buried within it. Rolling hills, dense forests, and rocky escarpments create natural barriers, isolating the village and its secrets. In the mists of dawn, one can almost imagine the movements of hidden societies, cloaked figures walking the paths where sunlight barely reaches, tending to archives that might hold the key to a bloodline the world has long forgotten. Every stone seems to murmur, hinting at alliances forged in silence and truths too powerful to be exposed. Rennes-le-Château is also intertwined with the broader mystery of the Priory of Chaon, a secretive order alleged to have guarded the Merovingian lineage across centuries. Alleged memberships included prominent intellectuals and noble families who sought to protect the knowledge that the church and other authorities wanted buried. The village becomes a focal point in this narrative, not merely a site of treasure or legend, but a repository of a story that challenges the official chronicles of European history. Here, sacred bloodlines are not theoretical constructs. They're living threads running through the very fabric of a land, traced in the parchments, the architecture, and even in the obscure inscriptions scattered throughout the church and its grounds. The story of Rennes-le-Château is also a story of human obsession. Countless individuals have been drawn to the village, chasing rumors of gold, relics, and hidden manuscripts. Yet beneath the allure of material treasure lies something far more elusive and profound. The search for truth, for understanding of a bloodline that carries significance far beyond wealth or power. Scholars, historians, and occultists alike have combed over every detail, from the intricate carvings on altars to the seemingly innocuous inscriptions on gravestones, searching for clues that might illuminate the hidden path of the Merovingians. In cinematic terms, Rennes-le-Château serves as both stage and character. The weathered stone of the church, the twisting alleyways, the sun-drenched vineyards, all contribute to an atmosphere thick with anticipation and unspoken secrets. Walking through the village is like stepping into a living tableau, where every object, shadow, and whisper seems to hint at a story that refuses to be fully revealed. The air itself feels charged with the residue of centuries of concealment and devotion, as if the past has left fingerprints too subtle for ordinary perception, but indelible to those who know how to look. Ultimately, Rennes-le-Château exemplifies the intersection of myth, history, and human curiosity. It is not just a village, nor merely a site of alleged treasure. It is a reminder that the Merovingian bloodline, and the sacred knowledge tied to it, has always existed at the margins of recorded history. In its quiet streets, the past lingers, defiant and enigmatic. The village challenges the notion of finality, suggesting that while kings fall and empires crumble, the currents of the sacred continue, hidden, persistent, and awaiting those willing to follow the faint trail of whispers left behind. The shadow of the bloodline casts itself long across Rennes-le-Château, entwining with every stone, every beam, and every faded manuscript. It is a shadow that stretches across centuries, a living testament to the idea that some truths cannot be destroyed. They can only be hidden, protected by silence and secrecy. And for those who are drawn into the mystery, the village becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a portal into a world where sacred blood flows unseen, yet indelibly, shaping the hidden story of Europe and the enduring legend of the Merovingians. Beneath the grandeur of cathedrals and the formal history of kings and conquests lies a quieter, subtler current, one that flows through the sacred feminine, through stories whispered in convents and cloisters, and through legends that refuse to be silenced. At the heart of this current is Mary Magdalene, a figure whose prominence in the Merovingian tradition may hold the key to understanding the hidden power of the bloodline. Unlike other saints, Magdalene is portrayed not as a peripheral disciple, but as a vessel of wisdom, a partner to the divine, and a bearer of knowledge that transcends the male-dominated structures of both church and state. Her presence in these narratives is neither accidental nor purely symbolic. It is an echo of an older, more mysterious truth about balance, union, and the sacred circulation of life. In early Christian texts and apocryphal writings, Magdalene's role is strikingly different from what later Orthodox tradition portrays. She is depicted as a teacher, a confidant, and, at times, even as the closest companion to Jesus. Some interpretations suggest she bore a child with him, an idea that scandalized the medieval church and threatened the very structure of patriarchal authority. The notion that a holy bloodline might flow through her veins, and by extension, through her descendants, adds a startling depth to the Merovingian mystery. This is not merely a question of genealogy. It is a question of spiritual inheritance, of knowledge and power carried in the sacred union of male and female principles. The Merovingians themselves appear to embody this duality. Kings and queens, male and female, were not merely political figures. They were conduits for the divine. The sacred feminine was always present in their rituals, their symbols, and their governance. From the frequent depiction of Mary Magdalene in their churches to the symbolic alignment of tombs and altars, the evidence suggests that the Merovingians recognized the feminine as an essential counterpart to the masculine line of kingship. This balance was not merely philosophical. It was practical, mystical, and possibly even encoded into the very rituals that sustained their claim to sacred authority. Through the centuries, the feminine aspect of this tradition became increasingly suppressed. As the Church consolidated power, the prominence of figures like Magdalene was downplayed or erased. Her story was reframed, her influence minimized, and her association with the sacred bloodline obscured. Yet remnants persist. In medieval manuscripts, in the allegorical language of the Grail romances, in the secret teachings preserved by mystics and initiates. These traces suggest a deep and deliberate effort to hide a truth that was considered too dangerous for the wider world, that the power of the sacred does not flow through kings alone, but through the union of masculine and feminine, through blood and spirit alike. In the context of Rennes-le-Château, this feminine tradition becomes even more tangible. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, with its enigmatic paintings and symbols, elevates her figure above all others, hinting at a hidden significance that the casual observer might miss. The presence of Magdalene is not decorative. It is didactic, a silent testimony to the belief that the sacred lineage depended upon both male and female lines, both kings and priestesses, both warrior and guardian. It is a recognition that power, in its most enduring and spiritual form, is never singular, never purely hierarchical. It is relational, shared, and sacred. The Cathars of southern France provide another thread in this tapestry. Their reverence for the feminine principle, their secret rituals, and their insistence on spiritual equality echo the older traditions that the Merovingians may have inherited. When the Church sought to eradicate heresy, it was not merely suppressing doctrinal differences, it was severing access to knowledge and lineages that had preserved the balance of sacred power across generations. The surviving fragments of Cathar teachings, cryptic though they are, suggest a conscious effort to protect the feminine key, to shield it from those who would use authority to dominate rather than to harmonize. Symbolism plays a crucial role in the Magdalene tradition. In art, architecture, and heraldry, she is represented as both mother and initiate, as the vessel of wisdom and the keeper of hidden currents. The language of symbols, lilies, chalices, rivers, and stars, often conveys her presence more clearly than the written word, encoding a memory of the sacred feminine that persists even when texts are censored or destroyed. The Merovingians, by embedding these symbols into their rituals, tombs, and regalia, ensured that the feminine thread remained unbroken, even when overt acknowledgement became politically dangerous. To understand the Merovingian bloodline without considering the feminine is to see only half the picture. The sacred lineage was not a solitary path, traced only through kings. It was a living tapestry woven from the union of complementary forces. Mary Magdalene, as emblem, ancestor, and spiritual guide, represents the hidden axis of this lineage, the source of continuity and power that balance the authority of the kings. Without her presence, the story of the Grail, the sacred blood, and the continuity of divine inheritance loses its coherence. The Magdalene tradition reminds us that history is not merely a record of conquest and crowns. It is also the story of what has been protected, hidden, and whispered across generations. The feminine principle, often erased from official accounts, endures in symbols, in ritual, and the memory of sacred bloodlines that refuse to die. In contemplating this tradition, we begin to see the Merovingians not merely as rulers, but as custodians of a profound secret, that the sacred is a union, a balance, and a legacy that flows through both male and female, through kings and queens, saints and initiates alike. In this way, the Magdalene tradition is not just a historical curiosity. It is a key, a guide for understanding how sacred bloodlines function, how divine knowledge is transmitted, and how the hidden currents of power can survive even the weight of history, suppression, and time. It invites the observer to look beyond the surface of kings and battles, beyond the visible hierarchies of church and state, and to perceive the subtle, enduring truth that the sacred feminine is not peripheral but central, not symbolic but essential, and that through her, the Merovingian legacy flows into the present, still waiting to be recognized. In the sun-drenched hills and hidden valleys of southern France, another current of secrecy and sacred knowledge ran parallel to the Merovingian legacy. The Cathars, a spiritual movement that flourished during the 12th and 13th centuries, represented a radical departure from the dominant doctrines of the Catholic Church. They were ascetics, mystics, and philosophers, yet to the Church they were heretics, dangerous not because of rebellion, but because they remembered something the hierarchy wanted buried, a lineage of divine knowledge, possibly tied to the sacred bloodline of the Merovingians. To understand the Cathars is to glimpse a world where the Grail was not merely a legend, but a living symbol of spiritual inheritance, a key to preserving what the world at large had forgotten. The Cathars believed in duality, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter, purity and corruption. Their philosophy resonated with the older traditions of Europe, echoing pagan and Gnostic teachings that had survived centuries of suppression. Central to their belief system was a reverence for spiritual knowledge and the sanctity of life, as well as an insistence that salvation could be achieved through understanding and inner purity rather than through the intermediaries of a hierarchical church. In this context, it is not difficult to imagine why the Merovingian bloodline, with its supposed sacred continuity and mystical powers, would be revered or even protected by such a community. The Cathars may have been guardians of a hidden truth, keepers of the same lineage that the Church sought to erase. Montségur, perched like a crown upon its rocky promontory, became the symbol of this resistance. The fortress, heavily fortified and seemingly impregnable, served not only as a stronghold for the Cathars, but as a sanctuary for knowledge, relics, and possibly records that traced sacred bloodlines through centuries of concealment. When the Church waged its crusade against the Cathars, culminating in the infamous siege of Montségur in 1244, it was more than a military campaign. It was an obliteration of memory. Thousands were burned, manuscripts destroyed, and a centuries-old network of knowledge was fractured. Yet the very act of attempting to erase them hints at the magnitude of what the Cathars protected, perhaps proof of a bloodline that intertwined the sacred and the human, an inheritance the Church feared could undermine its monopoly on spiritual authority. Among the ruins and charred remnants, traces of the Cathars' devotion endure. Their rituals, often conducted in secrecy, emphasized balance, the sanctity of the individual, and the recognition of hidden truths. Some scholars suggest that their veneration of the sacred feminine, particularly the figure of Mary Magdalene, connects directly to the Merovingian bloodline. The Grail, in this context, is transformed from a physical object to a symbol of knowledge and spiritual continuity, a vessel of wisdom transmitted not by gold or chalice, but through initiation, memory, and lineage. Every act of preservation, every whispered teaching, every coded manuscript becomes a testament to the bloodline survival in the shadow of persecution. The purge of the Cathars represents a larger pattern in European history, the systematic suppression of knowledge deemed too dangerous for the masses. Yet despite the violence, fragments endured, in manuscripts hidden within abbeys, in oral traditions passed quietly among families, in the subtle architecture of cathedrals and churches that encoded symbols of sacred lineage. These remnants suggest that the story of the Merovingians, intertwined with the Grail and the Magdalene tradition, was never entirely lost. It simply receded into shadows, awaiting those perceptive enough to follow the breadcrumbs left across centuries. This section of history also forces reflection on the nature of secrecy and power. The Church's crusade against the Cathars was not merely about heresy. It was about control over the sacred, over the idea that divinity could be transmitted through blood, through knowledge, and through initiation outside the sanctioned hierarchy. In seeking to extinguish the Cathars, the Church may have inadvertently immortalized the very mystery it sought to bury. Every destruction, every lost life, and every burned manuscript only amplified the aura of the Grail and the sacred bloodline, turning it into a legend that continues to captivate centuries later. The Grail, within the Cathar context, takes on a new dimension. It is not merely a treasure to be found or a cup to be held. It is a repository of wisdom, a symbol of continuity, and a reminder that the divine can persist outside institutional frameworks. The Cathars, in their reverence for the spiritual currents and the sacred feminine, acted as custodians of a living memory, a memory that connects the Grail to the bloodlines, the Merovingians to Magdalene, and the past to the present. They teach us that what is lost is not always destroyed. Sometimes it survives in shadow, in symbol, in the hearts of those who remember. By tracing the journey of the Cathars, the audience begins to see the pattern. Sacred knowledge, whether in the form of bloodlines, relics, or hidden teachings, has always been protected in silence. Its survival depends on secrecy, devotion, and the courage to maintain truth in the face of annihilation. The purge of Montségur, horrifying as it was, underscores the stakes, the lengths to which institutions will go to suppress that which challenges their authority. Yet in that very resistance lies hope. The Grail, the bloodline, and the knowledge of the Merovingians were never entirely extinguished. They persisted, hidden, waiting for the world to remember again. In contemplating the Cathars, we are reminded that history is often written by those in power, but memory is preserved by those who know how to see. The sacred bloodline, intertwined with the Grail and the Magdalene tradition, continues its quiet journey, invisible to the masses yet resilient against the tides of destruction. Rennes-le-Château, Montségur, the hidden manuscripts, and the surviving teachings all form a constellation of proof that the divine inheritance of the Merovingians, safeguarded by the Cathars, remains an enduring mystery, a shadow of truth that invites us to look beyond the surface and into the hidden currents of history. Even as centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the whispers of the Merovingian bloodline refused to fade entirely. Long after the last king's crown had been taken, long after the Church and the conquering dynasties of Europe attempted to erase their legacy, traces of the sacred line endured, quietly threading through the continent's noble families and secret societies. In modern Europe, this lineage may no longer be visible in grand coronations or public proclamations, yet its influence remains, concealed in archives, ancestral claims, and the subtle interplay of power and symbolism that has guided history from the shadows. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical knowledge and esoteric traditions, offered fertile ground for the survival of hidden bloodlines. Scholars, alchemists, and humanists delved into texts and artifacts long obscured, often uncovering hints of genealogies that defied conventional history. Some noble families, perhaps aware of their connection to the Merovingians, took extraordinary measures to preserve their ancestry, keeping records, seals, and symbols coded in a way that only initiates could understand. Here, lineage was not mere vanity. It was a living testament to sacred continuity, a channel through which spiritual authority could subtly influence culture, politics, and religious thought without ever drawing overt attention. Across Europe, these hidden currents intersected with secret societies that claimed to preserve the knowledge of ancient kings. The Rosicrucians, for instance, emerged in the 17th century with teachings that blended mysticism, alchemy, and philosophy. Many scholars have speculated that their doctrines, with their emphasis on hidden wisdom and spiritual regeneration, bear echoes of the Merovingian tradition, a way to perpetuate sacred knowledge in a world increasingly hostile to overt expressions of mystical authority. Similarly, Freemasonry, with its ritualized symbols, coded hierarchies, and veneration of esoteric lineage, may represent another layer of this protective network, safeguarding the memory and influence of a bloodline that could not safely be acknowledged openly. Some European noble families may have quietly claimed descent from the Merovingians, weaving their ancestry into a tapestry that stretches from medieval kings to modern aristocracy. This continuity, shrouded in secrecy, allowed them to exercise influence not through public dominance, but through subtle mechanisms: marriage alliances, patronage of the arts, and the discreet shaping of political and spiritual currents. Wealth, power, and cultural capital became tools not merely of ambition, but of preservation, ensuring that the sacred knowledge embedded within the bloodline survived even as history rewrote the narrative of Europe's rulers. France, in particular, became a focal point for this hidden legacy. Estates in Lorraine, Burgundy, and Provence may conceal traces of ancestral reverence for the Merovingians. Family crests, heraldic symbols, and private chapels often bear subtle marks: bees, fleur-de-lis, and Magdalene iconography that, to the trained eye, signify continuity and remembrance. These elements suggest a deliberate effort to protect the sacred line, using culture and ritual to maintain memory when the written word or public acknowledgement would have been dangerous. In these gestures, history and myth converge, allowing the bloodline to endure, invisible yet alive. Even in the modern era, rumors persist of secretive gatherings, coded correspondences, and hidden manuscripts that preserve genealogical knowledge lost to the general public. Scholars and historians who have pieced together archival evidence suggest that the Merovingian line may have survived not merely as a biological lineage, but as a spiritual current, a hidden transmission of authority, wisdom, and symbolic power. These modern threads connect not only to France, but across Europe, hinting that the sacred bloodline has influenced events, ideas, and institutions far beyond what conventional history acknowledges. This continuity challenges the notion of a sharp break between the medieval and modern world. It suggests that sacred bloodlines, once the domain of kings and queens, can persist through subtle, almost invisible forms of stewardship. Families, secret societies, and scholars become the custodians of memory, ensuring that the sacred is preserved not in public monuments, but in the quiet sanctuaries of culture, scholarship, and ritual. The Merovingian legacy, therefore, is not just a curiosity of the past. It is a living presence, threaded through Europe's history in ways that evade the casual observer but leave discernible traces for those who know where and how to look. The modern survival of these bloodlines also raises profound questions about power, secrecy, and legitimacy. If the Merovingians endure in some hidden form, then history's grand narratives of kings and empires may obscure more than they reveal. Authority and influence may flow not solely through conquest or institutions, but through memory, ritual, and blood, safeguarded by those who understood its sacred nature. In this sense, the story of the Merovingians is far from over. It extends into the present, a quiet current beneath the surface of Europe, linking past to present and reminding us that the sacred, like water beneath stone, continues to flow, unseen yet unbroken. To follow these hidden bloodlines is to look beyond the conventional markers of history, beyond coronations, battles, and political decrees. It is to read heraldry, trace genealogies, study coded manuscripts, and observe rituals that have persisted in the margins. In doing so, one begins to see a pattern of preservation and continuity, a testament to the enduring power of the Merovingians and the sacred knowledge they carried. Modern Europe, then, is not merely a landscape of cities and nations. It is a living repository of a hidden legacy, a continent subtly shaped by bloodlines that have survived centuries of suppression, waiting to be recognized by those willing to trace the currents of history and memory. Europe is a landscape steeped in memory, a continent where every stone, every cathedral, and every gilded manuscript carries whispers of the past. Hidden within its art and architecture lies a subtle, persistent language, one that speaks not to the casual observer, but to those attuned to the secret currents of history. For the Merovingians, and for the sacred bloodline they represented, symbols and structures became more than decoration. They became vessels for memory, encoding truths too dangerous to speak aloud. To walk through Europe with this perspective is to enter a world where art and architecture are not merely aesthetic expressions, but living repositories of concealed knowledge, guiding the initiated toward an understanding of sacred continuity. Gothic cathedrals, with their towering spires, intricate stained glass, and labyrinthine layouts, are among the most conspicuous examples. Every arch, every rose window, and every sculpted figure can be read as a signpost pointing toward the hidden heritage of the Merovingians. Fleur-de-lis motifs recur in subtle locations, sometimes carved into stonework where the eye might not immediately notice. Bees, often associated with kingship, immortality, and divine favor, appear in vaulted ceilings or heraldic emblems, connecting the sacred lineage to both ancient myth and medieval authority. The very geometry of these structures, the ratios, alignments, and sacred proportions, may encode cosmological and mystical knowledge, reflecting principles of balance, divine order, and the preservation of memory across generations. Artists themselves became custodians of hidden truths. Leonardo da Vinci, long celebrated for his genius, embedded layers of symbolism in works, such as The Last Supper and the Vitruvian Man. Scholars have argued that within these masterpieces are concealed clues hinting at a sacred lineage, perhaps even references to the union of Christ and Mary Magdalene, whose bloodline some allege connects to the Merovingians. These symbols were often subtle, intentionally ambiguous, ensuring that only those with the knowledge or insight to decipher them could access the deeper meaning. In this way, art became both shield and conduit, preserving secrets in plain sight. Manuscripts and illuminated texts also served as coded vessels for knowledge. Monastic scribes and illuminators meticulously illustrated their pages with hidden signs, patterns, and numerical codes. Marginalia, seemingly whimsical or decorative, sometimes concealed genealogical records or allegorical references to sacred bloodlines. The very act of creating these manuscripts was a ritual of preservation, a careful transmission of knowledge designed to survive centuries of suppression, censorship, and the eventual destruction of libraries and archives. Each illuminated page was a beacon, silently proclaiming the continuity of a sacred tradition to those capable of reading it. Even public monuments and civic architecture carry these traces. Medieval bridges, fountains, and palaces often incorporate symbolism rooted in pagan and early Christian traditions, blending geometry, numerology, and iconography to encode knowledge of lineage, spirituality, and cosmic order. The repetition of certain motifs, circles, triangles, stars, and crosses, can be interpreted as a coded map, guiding those initiated in sacred knowledge through a landscape infused with memory. The Merovingians, whose direct influence may have waned, continue to echo through these artistic languages, their sacred bloodline woven into the very fabric of European cultural heritage. The language of the sacred feminine, too, is omnipresent in art and architecture. Mary Magdalene, her attributes, her symbolic associations with lilies, rivers, and chalices, appears across centuries of European creativity. Her presence is a subtle acknowledgement of the balance essential to the continuity of the bloodline, the recognition that the divine is carried not only through kings, but through queens, priestesses, and female initiates who protected sacred knowledge when history sought to erase it. The architecture of churches, the placement of statues, and the motifs in stained glass all serve as reminders that lineage, power, and spiritual inheritance were inseparable from the feminine principle. Even seemingly mundane details, the orientation of a building, the alignment of an altar, the placement of a mural, may encode knowledge of astronomical cycles, sacred numerology, or genealogical markers. These are not accidents. They are deliberate acts of memory. Builders and artists, whether consciously or as part of an initiatory tradition, created structures that could communicate across centuries. In this sense, art and architecture function as time capsules, protecting truths about the Merovingians, the Grail, and the sacred bloodline from those who might seek to suppress them. The interplay between secrecy and visibility is critical. Symbols must be accessible enough to survive, carved in stone, painted on walls, or woven into tapestries, yet obscure enough to elude the uninitiated. This delicate balance ensured that sacred knowledge persisted, preserved by beauty, awe, and complexity. For the observant, these structures and artworks are not mere relics of the past. They are living maps, guiding modern seekers toward hidden histories and the enduring legacy of a bloodline once considered divine. In tracing these codes, the observer begins to see a pattern. The sacred bloodline was never solely a matter of ancestry. It was a living tradition, transmitted through art, architecture, ritual, and symbol. Each cathedral, each manuscript, each mural carries the imprint of those who understood the importance of continuity and secrecy. The Merovingians, though politically displaced, lived on through these hidden channels, their legacy etched into Europe's visual and spatial culture. Ultimately, the code within art and architecture reminds us that history is layered, and that truth often lies hidden beneath surface appearances. The sacred bloodline, preserved through symbols and structures, continues to speak to those willing to look, to interpret, and to remember. In this light, Europe itself becomes a vast repository of hidden knowledge, where the Merovingians' influence endures quietly but indelibly, waiting for those who can read the language written in stone, pigment, and form. As the story of the Merovingians unfolds across centuries, one is struck not by the grandiosity of their vanished kingdoms, but by the subtle persistence of their influence. Though their reign ended and their crowns were lost to history, the sacred bloodline they carried seems to have endured in shadows, whispers, and symbols, leaving traces that defy the conventional narrative of Europe. From hidden manuscripts to encoded architecture, from secret societies to legends of the Grail, the legacy of the Merovingians is not a relic of the past. It is a living thread that connects ancient mysteries to the present, inviting us to consider that history itself may conceal as much as it reveals. To understand this legacy, one must consider what was truly sacred to the Merovingians. It was not merely power or conquest, but continuity, an inheritance of divine authority transmitted through blood, ritual, and knowledge. Their kings were said to possess the divine touch, an ability to heal and bless that distinguished them from ordinary rulers. This mystical authority was intertwined with the sacred feminine, particularly in the figure of Mary Magdalene, whose association with the Grail and the lineage of Christ placed her at the heart of the secret. By preserving these connections, the Merovingians became not just political leaders, but custodians of a spiritual current that transcended conventional history. The attempts to erase them by the church, by rival dynasties, by the violent purges of heretics, only deepened the mystery. Every suppression, from the downfall of the Cathars to the destruction of hidden manuscripts, underscores the power of the knowledge they protected. Secrets that could challenge the official narrative of divine authority and spiritual inheritance were too dangerous to survive in the open, and so they were hidden, encoded, and transmitted in symbols, art, and bloodlines. Yet despite centuries of deliberate obfuscation, these currents persisted, often in ways invisible to the casual observer. Modern Europe, with its noble families, secret societies, and preserved traditions, may still bear the imprint of the Merovingians' hidden legacy. From Rennes-le-Château to Montségur, from coded manuscripts to ritualized architecture, traces of a sacred lineage suggest that their influence was never fully extinguished. It manifests subtly, guiding cultural currents, shaping esoteric thought, and inspiring quests for knowledge that bridge past and present. In this sense, the Merovingians endure not as rulers of kingdoms, but as stewards of memory, their story encoded in symbols and rituals that survive beyond the reach of conventional history. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this legacy is its invitation to the curious and the patient observer. The Merovingian story challenges us to look beyond official records, to question accepted histories, and to consider the hidden structures of power, knowledge, and inheritance. Every symbol in a cathedral, every coded manuscript, every whispered tradition becomes a clue in a puzzle that spans centuries. The bloodline is not merely genealogical. It is symbolic, spiritual, and deeply human, linking the past to the present in ways that are often imperceptible, but always significant. The Grail, the sacred feminine, the hidden bloodlines, they all converge in this enduring legacy. They remind us that history is not only about what is recorded, but also about what is protected, hidden, and remembered in silence. The Merovingians, through their blood, their rituals, and their symbolic influence, embody the persistence of hidden knowledge, a testament to the human capacity to safeguard what is sacred even in the face of erasure. Their story is a bridge between myth and history, legend and reality, the temporal and the eternal. Ultimately, the legacy of the Merovingians challenges us to reconsider our understanding of authority, divinity, and continuity. It asks us to recognize that power may not always be visible, and that knowledge can endure in forms subtle and elusive. The sacred bloodline they carried, entwined with Magdalene, the Grail, and secret traditions, is a reminder that history is layered, that truth is often concealed, and that some mysteries persist because they are too profound to be fully revealed. In tracing the threads of the Merovingians across centuries, one sees a pattern of resilience, secrecy, and spiritual continuity. Their influence, encoded in bloodlines, symbols, and hidden teachings, endures quietly beneath the surface of European history. It is a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that sacred knowledge survives in unexpected places, and that the mysteries of the Merovingians continue to invite exploration, reflection, and discovery. Theirs is a story of survival, of memory preserved in shadow, and of secrets that endure, waiting for those willing to see beyond the surface and into the hidden currents that flow through history itself.